And I've pointed this out in my book, which is titled The Face That Demonstrates the Farce of Evolution, that other than the scripture itself, Darwin's magnum opus, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, might well be the most significant literary work in the annals of recorded history. In fact, Sir Julian Huxley once said that the evolutionary dogma it spawned was the most powerful, the most comprehensive idea that had ever arisen upon Earth. It is the most fundamental of all intellectual revolutions. The 20th century can't be understood apart from this intellectual revolution. It has far-reaching consequences, and that is in virtually every field, every level of education, every area of practice. And I would say the most significant consequence is that it undermines the very foundation of the Christian faith. And nowhere is this more in evidence than at the Darwinian Centennial Convention, when Sir Julian Huxley proudly boasted that in the evolutionary system of thought, there was no longer need or room for the supernatural. He said that the earth was not created, the earth evolved. So did all of the animals and plants that inhabit it, including human selves, including mind and soul, brain and body. In fact, he said so did religion. And he went on to say that evolutionary man can no longer take refuge from loneliness by creeping for shelter in the arms of a divinized father figure whom he himself created as a figment of his own imagination. Of course, humanity's newfound autonomy ended up sacrificing truth on the altar of subjectivism. Ethics and morals no longer determined on the basis of some objective standard, but rather by the size and strength of the latest lobby group. And with no enduring reference point, societal norms were quickly reduced to mere matters of preference. Evolution is one of the most spectacular examples of how a speculative idea for which there is no hard evidence can come and overtake the thinking of a whole society, in fact, dominate a civilization. And I would say, in light of the tragic consequences of the evolutionary dogma, it is incredible to think that evolution is still today being touted as truth. And the responsibility for demonstrating that it is not truth, that in reality it is a farce, should no longer be left in the hands of a few hired guns in the bastions of higher learning. It's crucial that all thinking human beings, and that means you, are involved in this process as well. In fact, that is precisely why today I'm debuting Darwin's Dilemma on this broadcast. The debut of this incredible DVD is for the very purpose of putting it into your hand. You need to be informed, because if you are not informed, you are going to fall prey not only to this great cosmogenic myth, but to the consequences of this cosmogenic myth. And Illustrium Media has produced, I quite frankly, I don't know how to describe this, except I turned it on and I saw the computer animation, I saw the color, I saw the poignant remarks, the beauty of the presentation, and I was awestruck. And many of you know I have 12 kids. And I immediately said, we've got to sit down and watch this DVD together. In fact, last night I was going to watch this with one of my sons, Paul Stephen, and he kept asking me, Dad, let's watch this DVD together. and I was watching the presidential address, so we didn't get to watch it together. But we're going to watch it together. And he's going to ask me all kinds of questions. And in the process, he's going to be inoculated against a cosmogenic myth. Bottom line is that this is why we're doing the broadcast today. This is why I want to put this DVD into your hands. This is not about making a sale. This is about equipping you so you don't fall for mythology. Tomorrow we're going to talk about some of the consequences in my opening monologue. I've got some ideas of what I want to communicate to you about the consequences of the evolutionary dogma, including eugenics. Stay tuned. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Today I have two men on the broadcast who are no stranger to this ministry. Jonathan Wells, he's a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and he has 2 PhDs, one in molecular and cell biology from Berkeley and the other in religious studies from Yale. And I love the way he talks, and you will hear him not only on the DVD but during the broadcast. He is very thoughtful. He's a brilliant guy, but you can understand exactly what he's talking about. I can understand him. We also have Stephen Meyer. He's been on the broadcast many times as well. He's the director and senior fellow at the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. He's earned a PhD in history and philosophy of science from Cambridge. And he's written a lot of great books, including The Signature in the Cell, which we'll be talking about a little bit during the broadcast. His books, as well as Jonathan Wells' books, are available on the World Wide Web at equip.org. You got to take a look at them, purchase them. There just isn't any better literature in the field, so take a look at their books on the World Wide Web at equip.org, and I am very pleased to have them on the broadcast. Thank you for joining me today, gentlemen.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Hank. It's great to be back.
This DVD is stunning, and Stephen, I want to start with you. It's titled Darwin's Dilemma. We should start out communicating exactly what Darwin's dilemma was.
Well, Darwin was a scientist and therefore committed, in theory, to following the evidence wherever it leads. But the problem with the Cambrian explosion is that, and the Cambrian fossil record all around the world, is that it points in exactly the opposite direction that his theory indicates we should be seeing as far as the evidence. We find Darwin's most famous icon, as Jonathan has put it, is the universal tree of life, the idea that all the living forms that exist today, whether we're looking at birds or reptiles or mammals, all evolved from simpler pre-existing forms going back to a simple primordial organism. And that process of evolution would have created a great kind of branching tree over time as one form morphed gradually into other more complicated forms, which in turn morphed and evolved into other more complicated forms right up to the present. On that picture of the history of life, you should expect to see a series of transitional forms going back to the very earliest times in geologic history in the fossil record, and you should see those gradual transformations. What the fossil record shows in the Cambrian is precisely the opposite, and the Cambrian is extremely significant because that's the place where the first major animal forms arise, and instead of seeing those animal forms arise gradually through a series of transitional intermediates of ancestral precursors that are each slightly different than the one preceding it, what you find is the sudden appearance of major new forms of body design and no ancestral forms to which they connect in the preceding fossil layers. So it's a dilemma for Darwin because he, as a scientist, was committed to following the evidence where it leads, but the evidence is leading precisely in the opposite direction of what his theory says.
What's interesting to me in the DVD, you not only have Dr. Jonathan Wells, yourself, Stephen Meyer, Richard Sternberg, Doug Axe, but you also have quotes from Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Dawkins. You have an interview with Simon Morris, and these are evolutionists.
And James
Question.
Valentine, a leading paleontologist from Berkeley, Paul Chen, paleo-marine biologist at the University of San Francisco. It's really a star-studded cast in the film as far as the science goes.
But wouldn't you think, Stephen, that at the very beginning, these guys would say, Darwin's dilemma is my dilemma. It seems to put an end to the evolutionary cosmogenic myth.
Well, there are scientists who are committed to a naturalistic worldview, who are not open to the concept of design, and they are yet nevertheless honest about what the science does and does not establish. James Valentine, a very prominent paleontologist from UC Berkeley, wrote a wonderful book in 2004 called On the Origin of the Phyla. And the phyla or phylum is the broadest classification in classificatory category in the animal world, and the new animal forms each represent completely new phyla or new body designs. And in his book On the Origin of the Phyla, Valentine was very explicit about the inability of contemporary neo-Darwinism to account for the pattern of fossil evidence, but also account in a mechanistic sense, give a causal explanation of how you would generate all this fantastically new form. So Valentine is committed to an evolutionary approach, but has been very honest about its limitations and deficiencies with respect to the origin of the major new forms of life as they arise across the history of life.
Dr. Wells, I want to ask you a question about vested interests. Today you have people who have a vested interest in the evolutionary dogma. If you walk away from it, if you disparage it, it has a dramatic impact on your career. But this doesn't seem to be true for a younger generation coming up who sees this kind of evidence, doesn't have a vested interest, and may look at it in a far more objective light. Is that being too Pollyannish?
Well, I think there is a lot of hope in the younger generation because they do come at it with a fresh mind and an open mind, at least relative to their seniors. But there's still a problem, and that is if a 20-year-old wants to pursue a career in biology or even most other sciences, then that young man or that young woman had better keep his or her mouth shut on this issue or find that there is no career ahead of them. I'm sad to say that that's unfortunately the case right now. There's a strong, as you know, Hank, a strong metaphysical component here. I mean, it's a religion we're talking about, a materialistic religion. And the people who embrace it now control our academic and scientific establishments. So a young person up and coming may very well see the truth, but may find that doors close if he or she speaks that truth.
We're talking about the Cambrian explosion. It's a big part of the DVD. As soon as we come back from the break, I'm going to ask Dr. Wells to give us an explanation of what the Cambrian explosion is. What is an explosion in geological terms? We're going to define all that for you and so much more. Again, that's coming up on the other side of the break. But I want to remind everybody listening in right now that we're not talking about a apologetic issue here. We're talking about the apologetic issue. How one views their origins ultimately will determine how they live their lives. If you believe that you're a function of random chance, that you arose from the primordial slime, you're going to live your life by a different standard than if you believe that you are created in the image of God and thus accountable to Him. We're talking once again about Darwin's dilemma. It's the mystery of the Cambrian fossil record. The DVD is available through the Ministry of the Christian Research Institute. It's a must. It's an absolutely exquisite product, but it will have a lifelong dividend, not only in your life, but the lives of your family members. You can check it out on the World Wide Web at equip.org, or just give us a call at 888-7000-CRI. Be right back with my two guests in just a moment. Please don't touch that dial.
You're watching the Bible Answer Man broadcast. To find out more about the topics discussed, visit our website at www.equip.org.
And I appreciate both these guys so much. They are not only brilliant, but they can speak in language that even I can understand. And you will find that to be so true when you get Darwin's Dilemma and watch it. They are plain speaking, although very brilliant men. They're communicating in language that we can comprehend, we can assimilate, and then we can use it to make a difference. Darwin's Dilemma, it's available. You can check it out on the World Wide Web at equip.org. You can order at Post Office Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, zip code 28271, or when you speak to our resource consultants at 888-7000-CRI. Again, I'm speaking to Stephen Meyer, Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute. He is a man who earned his Ph.D. in the history and philosophy of science from Cambridge. And Dr. Jonathan Wells, he's also a Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute. He has 2 Ph.D.s, one in molecular and cell biology from Berkeley and one in religious studies from Yale. And again, pleased to have both of them with us. Dr. Wells, question for you with respect to the Cambrian explosion. Can you explain to people exactly what that is?
Well, I'll give it a shot. There are 2 aspects of the explosion worth noting. One is how short it was. Life supposedly began on the Earth about 3.8 billion years ago. And if we compress that into a 24-hour period, so we have a clock now, we start the clock. The first life form is a single-celled organism. And we let the clock run 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 15 hours. All we have are these single-celled organisms, all the way up past the 20th hour on the clock. And then at the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, we have an explosion. That's where the term comes from, an explosion of all the major animal body forms, multicellular organisms. The second aspect of the explosion is the extent of it. We humans have a hard skeleton inside and a soft body on the outside. And so we're in what is called a phylum that includes reptiles, birds, fish, and so on. Now, an insect has a hard skeleton on the outside and a soft body on the inside. So does a crab. Those animals are in another phylum because they have a totally different body plan. Well, there are several dozen different phyla, all of them very fundamentally different in their body plan. And according to Darwin's theory, as Steve said a few minutes ago, you would expect these different phyla to emerge after millions and millions of generations of gradually branching transitional forms. But what we find in the Cambrian explosion is that all the major phyla appear at the same time in this very brief geological instant of time. And it's the most remarkable feature of the fossil record.
And would you say to people listening in that not only do they appear abruptly, but they are enormously complex?
Already, as soon as they appear. I mean, an insect, well, there weren't insects in the Cambrian explosion, but there were members of the phylum that insects are in. And when they appear, as you say, they have compound eyes, articulated limbs, and bodies every bit as complex as we see today, right there at the beginning.
Question for you, Dr. Meyer. Someone listening in right now saying in their minds, I'm going to get this DVD because I don't even believe there was such a period as the Cambrian period, and therefore this DVD wouldn't be relevant to me. What would you say to them?
Well, there's pretty good evidence that that life a long time ago was different than it is now, and there's been an orderly progression in the history of life of layers of rock laid upon each other, and so geologists have been able to name and label those layers, and so we know from watching the way sediments are laid down today that older stuff is on the bottom and younger stuff gets laid down on top of it. So if you go back in time, you can get a picture of the history of life, the progression of life forms as they come into existence. And the striking thing about that progression is that it's decidedly non-Darwinian, and it's fascinating. I mean, we have these impressions in rocks of creatures that are in many cases no longer with us, and we can really see what they were like. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study just for its own sake. And then there are other creatures that are with us still today. One of the forms that's preserved in the Cambrian is a comb jelly, and there's been absolutely no evolution over that entire span of geologic history. Comb jellies today are pretty much the same kind of critters that first appeared in the Cambrian. So there's a whole bunch of puzzles here from a Darwinian point of view. The sudden appearance, the absence of transitional form, the stasis, the absence of change over long periods of time. But I think the fundamental puzzle is actually how do you build these animals? Because the Darwinian mechanism, for many reasons that we could explain, is just not a sufficient or adequate cause for the production of the kind of intricate and integrated complexity that we see in these organisms. And one thing I think I should just make clear is that the Cambrian explosion is not some isolated anomaly for modern evolutionary theory. The central question that Darwin was trying to explain in his book, The Origin of Species, in 1859, was the origin of new biological form. And here we are in 2009, and that question is still unresolved. In fact, there was a book that came out with MIT Press just a couple years ago called On the Origin of Organismal Form, and in the introduction to this book, written by some very leading evolutionary and theoretical biologists, the authors of the introduction, the editors, listed a series of questions that modern Darwinism had failed to answer, and one of them was the origin of form. And I thought to myself, but wait, I thought that was the question it was supposed to have resolved, and I think that's where we are. 150 years on, we have this puzzling pattern of appearance in the fossil record, but we also have no evolutionary mechanism that can account for the origin of these new complex integrated structures, these new body plans and body designs that arise with the Cambrian animals.
You are a committed Christian as well as an accomplished scientist. How important is it for all of us to be able to not only as Christians be able to read the Scriptures for all it's worth, but learn to read the book of nature?
Well, I think that was one of the ideas that inspired the scientific revolution, and this is one of the things that really I think is unfortunate about the impression that people get of science in modern times. There's been a kind of historical revisionism that's gone on that has told us that science and religion are at odds, and that there's been this warfare between science and religion, and the aggressors in the war were always the religionists, the church, the Christians who were trying to suppress all the knowledge that science had to give in favor of their superstitious notions. In fact, if you read the literature on the origin of modern science, the period that science historians call the period of the scientific revolution, what you find is that historians are nearly unanimous in agreement about the important positive role that the Christian worldview played in sponsoring modern science. There was a key concept that the early scientists, Kepler, Newton, Galileo, Hooke, Copernicus, many of the early scientists believed that nature was intelligible. And it was intelligible because it had been designed by a rational, intelligent agent, namely the God of the Bible. And because nature was intelligible, and because we had been made in the image of the God who had made nature, it was possible for us to discern the patterns, the order, and the design that was built into nature. Kepler summarized it beautifully, saying that it was the calling of the natural philosopher, which was the name for scientists at the time. It was the calling of the natural philosopher to think God's thoughts after him.
We are going to take the calls of those who are patiently hanging on. And by the way, if you want to ask your question, the number to dial, 888-ASK-HANK. We will get to your calls in the next segment. Quick question before we go to break, Dr. Wells. How do you make a case for intelligent design on the basis of the Cambrian explosion?
Well, it's important to note that intelligent design is not, as some of its critics claim, an argument from ignorance. We don't look at something and say, well, we don't know what caused it, therefore it must be intelligently designed. Nobody does that. As Steve Meyer has eloquently written, design is actually in some ways using the present to understand the past. When we look at complex specified information in the present, such as we see in the DNA molecule, for example, the sequence in DNA that specifies proteins, that kind of information in our experience arises only from intelligence. And the interesting thing about the Cambrian explosion in this regard is that these different forms of animals required a vast amount of this information, this genetic information, to make the proteins they needed for their bodies. And this this information appears to have come into existence, as far as the fossil record is concerned, very quickly. Well, the only source we know for such information is intelligence, and especially when it arises so rapidly, the inference to design is pretty hard to escape.
We're talking to Dr. Jonathan Wells and Dr. Stephen Meyer. Their books available on the World Wide Web at equip.org. Again, your questions on the other side of the break, so please be patient with us. We will get to you in just a few moments. Again, if you want to call in your question, to ask a question to Stephen Meyer or Jonathan Wells, the number is always to dial, 888-ASK-HANK. That translates to 888-275-4265. My purpose in doing this broadcast today is to put Darwin's Dilemma, the DVD, into your hands. We can talk about Darwin's Dilemma, we can talk about Darwinism, we can talk about the consequences of Darwinism, but you need to get the DVD so you're equipped to always make a difference, to give a reason for the hope that lies within you with gentleness and with respect. It's available on the World Wide Web at equip.org. When you write me at Post Office Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, zip code 28271, or when you talk to our resource consultants at 888-7000-CRI. Be right back with your questions. Please don't touch that dial. And again, delighted to have with me on the broadcast today two obscurantists that have lost their brains in the narthex of a church somewhere. Well, at least that's the caricature. Actually, two incredibly bright guys. Stephen Meyer, he earned his Ph.D. in the history and philosophy of science from Cambridge, and Jonathan Wells, two PhDs, one in molecular and cell biology at Berkeley, the other in religious studies at Yale. And we're talking about Darwin's Dilemma. And Dr. Wells, it occurs to me that I didn't ask you to define what Darwin's Dilemma was, so we have some kind of contextualization for the title of the DVD.
Sure. As both Steve and I said earlier, Darwin's theory is that the major groups of animals gradually evolved from a common ancestor in a branching tree pattern. So Darwin himself pointed out that you would expect to find in the fossil record innumerable transitional forms from this common ancestor leading up to the animals that appear in the Cambrian. And yet the fossil record is completely empty of these forms, and that is Darwin's dilemma. Now sometimes, in fact recently, some scientists in England redefined Darwin's dilemma to mean, as they put it, the absence of fossils before the Cambrian. But of course there is no absence of fossils before the Cambrian. What we have before the Cambrian are lots of fossils, but none of them, or very few of them, could possibly be seen as transitional forms leading up to the Cambrian. So it's the absence of transitional forms that is Darwin's dilemma. And the more fossils we find before the Cambrian that aren't transitional forms, the deeper the dilemma becomes.
Dr. Meyer, a question with respect to what you would hope could take place if I would sit down with one of my children, or someone listening in sat down with one of their children and watched this video together with them.
Well, a number of things. One of the things I would like to say about the film itself is that the guys at Illustra Media really outdid themselves. Not only is it visually beautiful and it teaches a lot of science, but there's a mystery story here, and they pick it up right at the beginning, at the time of the writing of The Origin of Species, making it clear that Darwin himself was concerned about this. He was intrigued. He was worried that this was a very valid objection to his theory, but he assumed that subsequent generations of scientists would find the missing transitional forms that Jonathan was just talking about. And what the film does is it actually, in much the manner of a detective, it traces those successive attempts to find those fossil forms and to account for their absence. And one by one, it shows how these different investigations and attempts at explaining away the absence of the necessary evidence have failed, and we're left with a real explosion, a real evidence of a very sudden, geologically sudden appearance of all this new form and structure and information. And then at the end of the film, they explore what that means and how, as a number of us argue, the presence of all this new information arising suddenly with these Cambrian animals is a distinctive indicator of intelligent activity. I unpack the logic of this in the book Signature in the Cell. In fact, I quote a scientist who says that information is habitually associated with conscious activity. So when you find in the appearance of all these new forms of life, a massive infusion of new information in order to get them built, you're looking at a distinctive effect of intelligent design. So you've got a strong indicator of that. So there's a scientific story here. There's a lot of scientific information. It's very informative. Jonathan does a great job in the film of explaining exactly what a phylum is and many of the basic ideas of Darwinian thought. And then you have all these leading scientists talking about the key discoveries. But at the end of the film, it also then explores the idea and the evidence for intelligent design and suggests that this scientific evidence may be pointing beyond the material world to another reality that should give us all some hope that there may be purpose beyond the material world, in contrast to the stated view of this materialistic worldview that has so dominated our elite culture and the scientific establishment since the time of Darwin.
Again, Darwin's Dilemma, the DVD, available through the Ministry of the Christian Research Institute. Order now on the World Wide Web at equip.org via the mail at Post Office Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, zip code 28271, or when you talk to our resource consultants at 888-7000-CRI. You allude to a book titled Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. This is an incredible resource which is available on the World Wide Web at equip.org, so check it out. And Stephen Meyer, I want to have you on the broadcast soon to talk about this book. There's something, Jonathan Wells, that you allude to in the DVD, Darwin's Dilemma. You talk about the fact that we've grown accustomed to thinking that DNA is the blueprint for the body plan of an organism, but you actually say it's more of a parts list and the plan comes from something else.
That's correct. Now, this does not in any way weaken Steve's argument and Signature in the Cell. The fact is, the best explanation we have for the complex information in DNA sequences is intelligence. But my point in the film and elsewhere is that that's not all. There's much more to the cell than the information in the DNA, and we're just beginning to understand a little bit about where that other information is. So even if Darwinism could explain the information in the DNA, which it can't, it would still be a long way from explaining the origin of animal body plans. There's much more involved.
I want to go to the phone lines, take a quick caller here. Edward in Springfield, Missouri, listening on KSCV. Hi, Edward.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. You're on with Dr. Wells and Dr. Meyer.
Hi. Hey, my question is, I've heard through the grapevine that in The Origin of the Species that Darwin, at the end of that book, said that if this is not proven as fact within 100 years, that what he has taught in that book is no good. And I wanted to find out, is there any truth to that? And if it is, where can I find out that information?
Darwin doesn't get that specific about the conditions of his theory's success, but he does lay out a couple of concerns about his own theories, quite candid about problems. One is the problem of complex organisms, and he says that if there is any complex system that's discovered that couldn't be explained by a series of gradual, step-by-step changes, that his theory would be in real trouble. And he also acknowledges that the Cambrian explosion, which he knew about already in 1859, but which we've learned much more about in successive scientific investigations, he knew that the Cambrian explosion was a huge problem for his theory, and said that it was legitimate to regard it as an inexplicable mystery. I'd like to just piggyback on Jonathan's answer of Hank's last question, though, because I think people will be excited when they understand just how acute the problem for modern neo-Darwinism now is, because of the discovery of these higher levels of information. According to neo-Darwinism, the new forms of animals arise as a result of random mutations in the DNA material in DNA. If, however, to build an animal you need information beyond just what's in DNA, then you can mutate DNA indefinitely, and you're never going to build a new animal form. And so the Darwinian mechanism has relied entirely on mutations in DNA, and we're beginning to understand that to build the kind of animals that arise in the Cambrian, you would have needed lots of other types and forms of information, kind of the difference between the parts list and the overall blueprint that tells the parts how to be put together. And so Jonathan's work on what's sometimes called ontogenetic information is a really critical challenge to neo-Darwinism, and it's something that the film explores. This is a very cutting-edge development in biology. If you read the media reports, you get the idea that the intelligent design people are backwards, white-shoed Bible thumpers that are, kind of troglodytes and Neanderthals. But it's actually the case that the ID scientists, including Jonathan and some of his colleagues who are working on this, are right on the cutting edge of developments in biology, and it's really neo-Darwinism that can't keep pace with the new developments and the new discoveries.
And no one comes to this issue with a white lab coat on in the first place, do they?
Well, one of the things about this issue, and I think it underscores a point you were making earlier, Hank, is that this is not beyond the reach of most educated people to understand. Educated lay people can understand this issue, and Jonathan's book, Icons of Evolution, the various videos you've been mentioning. This is more like detective reasoning. You learn what modern biology has discovered, and then you ask yourself the question, well, how do we piece together these clues to figure out what happened? It's a fascinating intellectual exercise, but smart people of various kinds of training can understand this. Lawyers, theologians, doctors. This is not an issue that we should allow the elites to control. In fact, one of the things I'm finding is that in making the case for intelligent design, we find a lot of sympathy among software designers, among mechanical and electrical engineers, among medical doctors. These are smart people, and if the Darwinists can't persuade them, they've got a problem. In one poll a couple years ago, over 60% of U.S. doctors expressed skepticism about neo-Darwinism. Why? Well, I think it's because they know a lot about the body and they know a lot about design, and so. This is. I'd encourage your listening audience not to be intimidated by the elite experts, the evolutionary biologists. Other people have relevant expertise to this, and they've got good common sense. So we can suss this out like good detectives.
Got some challenging media questions coming up on the other side of the break. Again, Darwin's Dilemma, the mystery of the Cambrian fossil record. Available. It is an intoxicating DVD. You just don't want to be without it. I mentioned this before, but if you loved Privileged Planet, you're going to love this DVD. It's available on the World Wide Web at equip.org. You can order there. You can order via phone, 888-7000-CRI, or when you write me at Post Office Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, zip code 28271. We will be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
You're watching the Bible Answer Man broadcast. To find out more about the topics discussed, visit our website at www.equip.org.
I am just passionate about the subject at hand. Many of you know from reading my books or hearing my talks in various places that I myself walked away from the Christian faith early on because I did not get substantive answers to my questions. I thought that Darwin had long ago explained away in the beginning God, and therefore, because I didn't get satisfactory answers, I thought there were no satisfactory answers. We live in a day and age now where we have incredible DVDs, not just books, but DVDs that have been developed with computer animation, just in striking settings. We can sit down for 40 or 50 minutes, maybe an hour with our kids, watch the DVD, and this DVD has all kinds of features. It has a bonus section in which I was just watching Dr. Wells answering questions, a Q&A session on the DVD. On top of that, it has a virtual museum. You can see fossils in that virtual museum. It's an incredible product. I wish I would have had that when I was in high school. You don't have to wish. It's available right now. You can order it on the World Wide Web at equip.org. When you write me at Post Office Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, zip code 28271. And when you talk to our resource consultants at 888-7000-CRI, in those early days when I began looking at the issue of evolution, I couldn't have dreamed of the possibility of speaking to a Jonathan Wells or a Stephen Meyer, and yet I have that opportunity today, and you have an opportunity to join in the discussion. We're getting social media questions. Here's one. Michael in Illinois has a very erudite question regarding the theory of Darwinian evolution. He writes, given that no other theory accounts as well for the fossil record, which today is tremendous and undeniable, which accounts for interspecies relationships, which through DNA analysis are today obvious, categorizes all plants and animals according to those relationships in a logically coherent, empirically convincing way. Boy, this is a great question. And comports with natural selection, a process we can observe among species from microbes on up. How can you rule out Darwin's theory? The fact that Darwin's theory has sometimes been used for evil purposes does not warrant its rejection any more than, say, the misuse of a kitchen knife would warrant the banning of cutlery. How do you answer that, Dr. Wells?
Well, in a sense, I agree with that. If the theory actually holds up under the evidence, then we have to accept it and try to deal with, potentially evil consequences of it. But the fact is, the theory does not hold up. For example, the quote you just gave us says something about natural selection. Well, natural selection happens. Nobody denies it. But every time we observe natural selection, it does not change the species. It operates within existing species. It's like artificial selection, which people were observing for centuries before Darwin came along. Nobody questions the power of selection to modify individuals in an existing species. The problem is natural selection has never been observed to produce a new species, much less a new organ or body plan. And yet that's the essence of Darwin's theory. So this idea that Darwin's theory is scientifically undeniable is simply false.
What about, Dr. Meyer, the undeniable evidence, according to Michael, for interspecies relationships, which through DNA analysis today is obvious?
Oh, I was hoping you'd ask me about that. This is where I'm a philosopher of science by training, and sometimes I've been dismissed because I'm not a scientist. But this is where that it's helpful to have someone from outside the discipline do some logical accounting. These studies that are often used to develop phylogenetic relationships compare genes from different species, and for alleged similarities, and if similarities be found, then an inference is made about an organism that was a common ancestor, allegedly a common ancestor for both organisms. Problem is that the computer programs that analyze the evolutionary relationships between gene sequences in different organisms are programmed with the assumption that there must have been a common ancestor. So you actually have two different possibilities when you encounter similar gene sequences. Similar gene sequences could be the result of a designer using a well-established strategy or for building the same basic parts that are used in completely different systems, or it might be the result of common descent. But the computer program is programmed in such a way as to ensure that the outcome confirms common descent. The programs are built with the assumption that similarity means common ancestry. So you can't take the outcome of those phylogenetic analyses as evidence for common ancestry when common ancestry is assumed from the very outset. Moreover, there's some very interesting new developments in genetics and genomics that are challenging the idea that we only have similarity between, say, humans and chimps. There's a problem known as orphan genes, the genes that are found only in particular organisms, completely unique. If similarity means common ancestry, what does completely unique genetic sequences, what do completely unique genetic sequences indicate? Moreover, the so-called junk DNA that was thought by the Darwinists to be a compelling evidence of non-design and of the activity of the random mutation and selection process. The junk DNA is now known to have many important functions, and overall the function of the junk DNA is much like an operating system in a computer that's telling the other information in the genome when to turn on and when to turn off and when to be expressed and when to be suppressed. So that's well, the important thing about that is that the non-coding DNA is now being discovered to be species-specific. It's unique from one species to another. So you don't have these arguments from similarity to common ancestry that those arguments are no longer valid for other reasons. So folks, I was impressed by the defiant tone of the questioner, but people, before they get so convinced that anyone questioning evolution has stepped off the edge of the rational universe, it's sometimes helpful to get up to date on the most current data in biology.
It's also interesting, Dr. Wells, that you have pointed out that the fossil record flatly says no. There's no evidence for common descent, but there are arguments that have been posited over the years: Goldsmith's hopeful monster theory, Gould's punctuated equilibrium. Maybe you don't have all kinds of vertical transitional forms, but that's because there were leaps.
Well, apparently there were leaps. The question is what produced them. Goldsmith thought they were what he called macro mutations. That is, a single mutation that at one fell swoop produces a major change in the organism. The problem is we never see them. Fruit flies have been mutated in every possible way at this point, and yet no matter what we do to the DNA of a fruit fly, an embryo fruit fly, there's only three possible outcomes: a healthy fruit fly, a sick fruit fly, or a dead fruit fly. The mutations don't change it. So the macromutation theory just doesn't work.
I like your illustration in the DVD. You said
Jonathan,
no horse flies and no horses.
Jonathan, are you saying the only good fruit fly is a dead fruit fly?
Well, sometimes I think that around my kitchen when we have fruit out, but the point is that the neo-Darwinian mechanism does not do what it's supposed to do.
Another question that just came in, PT in North Carolina has this question. I want both of you to comment on this. He's talking about a broadcast I did with Lee Strobel on intelligent design, made a couple of points which I think need to be further addressed. He goes on to say the work of Michael Behe has been totally discredited. Don't use it to support your anti-evolution position. And he talks about a judge's decision in Pennsylvania in which Behe was demonstrated to be a fraud. And he says, finally, you and Lee Strobel unconsciously, I think, commit a dreadful logical fallacy in arguing against evolution. If I were to paraphrase you both, you'd say, I just can't figure out how it's possible. And then you move on to state factually that it can't be possible. Your comments?
Well, may I jump in on that one? The chapter 17 in my book, The Signature in the Cell, addresses this claim head on. The argument is often made that the case for intelligent design is nothing more than an argument from ignorance, and our argument is parodied as saying the following: since we can't think of how evolution could have produced System X, therefore it must have been intelligently designed, or therefore God must have done it. Well, if that was how we were arguing, that would be an argument from ignorance. But we're not arguing that way. We're saying that there are certain features that of living systems, for example, the information encoded in DNA, that have not been accounted for by any known natural cause, by any cause that we can observe in our present experience. But in addition to that, we know of a cause that is capable of producing, for example, specified digital information, and that cause is intelligence. So when we survey the array of possible causal explanations, intelligent design is best, not because of what we don't know, but because of what we do know about A, the inner workings of life, and B, about the cause and effect structure of the world, about what we see occurring in our uniform and repeated experience. So it's not, the argument for intelligent design is not an argument from ignorance, it's an inference to the best explanation. And as for the judge in central Pennsylvania, I'll put my money on Mike Behe, biochemist, Lehigh University, any day over a federal judge. The discussion of the origin of life is not something that can be decided by a federal judge, and Judge Jones was operating way above his pay grade. And Behe has not been refuted. His ideas about irreducible complexity, I think, have been reinforced by recent developments and in biochemistry, quite the contrary to his critics.
Hank, if I could just jump in, this Behe claim, the claim that he's been refuted, and also the talk about the judge, if your listeners want more information, they should go to the Discovery website. That's www.discovery.org/CSC. There's lots of stuff there by Behe and by others, including lawyers, analyzing, the Dover decision. And the idea that it's a dead issue is just nonsense.
Yeah, one additional resource we might mention is the new textbook, Explore Evolution, that discusses the argument about irreducible complexity, and in a point-counterpoint fashion, it presents Behe's initial critique of the power of natural selection to produce irreducibly complex systems. It then presents a discussion of what's called the co-option objection to Behe, and then shows that there's a very compelling objection to the idea of co-option, the idea that you can build up these complex machines from simpler molecular precursors. So that debate has not by any means been settled in favor of the Darwinists.
Dr. Wells, I want to thank you so much for being on the broadcast. It's been a great privilege.
My pleasure.
Dr. Myers, as always, it has been, same as with Dr. Wells, an incredible privilege to have you on the broadcast.
It's been great to be with you, Hank, and thanks for highlighting for your audience this important new resource. I think people are going to be blown away. It's a great mystery story, it's a great scientific argument, and it's all woven together with beautiful visuals.
And again, it's called Darwin's Dilemma, the Mystery of the Cambrian Fossil Record. It is available to the World Wide Web at equip.org. When you write me at Post Office Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, zip code 28271. And when you speak to our resource consultants at 888-7000-CRI, remember how one views their origins ultimately will determine how they live their life. This is not just a apologetic issue, it's the apologetic issue. Darwin's Dilemma, it is a must for you, for your family, and for your friends. We're out of time for this edition of the Bible Answer Man broadcast. Look forward to seeing you next time with more of the show.